Lauren Boone, and we are back for part 2 of assessments that matter, consistent and fair resources. If you did miss part 1, we were talking about the new standards, specifically about standard 1.3 and 1.4, which kind of correlates to the old assessment system, but certainly talks very, very clearly and articulately about that need for the pre-assessment, the pre-validation to be undertaken. So there is a huge amount of change in language, or there's a variety of language that people use. So some people, will refer to moderation. Some people will refer to validation. Some people will say pre and post validation. For the purposes of this, I'm going to refer to pre and post validation. Now, pre-validation is that checking of the assessment tool itself to make sure that the assessment tool will allow for compliant evidence to be built. Okay. It's a process that we're going through when we're building our assessment tools. And it's that cross-check of, the mapping guide generally with what the assessment tool has. And particularly the things that I tend to look for are things like I'll pick out a really practical criteria, like watching the student, needing to see a student communicate effectively with someone or implement a process. And then I will look to see how that's reflected in the instructions and where that evidence is recorded, and generally that should be through an observation checklist. And then there would generally be like a third party or like a supplemental form of evidence, and that might be a form, it might be a presentation, it might be meeting minute notes, it might be a job card, it might be a recipe card, that sort of a thing. So that's kind of what we would expect to see in that sort of a case. Post-validation is validation that the completed student assessment, reflects all of the relevant evidence, okay? So pre-validation is going to focus more on principles of assessment, whereas post-validation is going to focus very, very much on the rules of evidence, okay? Is there, in terms of, does it actually cover everything? Is there a quality, quantity, and relevance of evidence? And guys, quality and quantity, you go for quality over quantity. Okay. I am seeing a lot more assessment tools out on the market that they're a lot bigger. Okay. I would argue that they're compliant from a perspective of when I check, there's an observation check, there's an observation that checks across everything. However, what I am also seeing is that quite often they're becoming so big that they're very difficult for students to follow. And one of the things that we see often in this, which I really, to some extent, I really like, is that when somebody sells an assessment tool, they give you 2 options for that assessment tool, one for the assessment evidence to be collected in the workplace, and one for the assessment evidence to be collected in simulation. And so, you've got an assessment tool and you've got multiple methods that you can use in order to allow the student. So from that fairness and flexibility perspective, that's fantastic. However, the intent of the assessment designer and developer in that instance is that RTO then takes that and goes, okay, here's the assessment tool in its final form if you're collecting it in the workplace. And here's the assessment tool if you're collecting it in simulation. Okay. When you put all of that together and you just throw that at the students don't know what they're doing. Even sometimes trainers and assessors don't know what they're doing. It's so big. It becomes really, really hard to follow. And so quality over quantity. Okay. In the same way that I do see assessment tools where they'll have a question against every performance criteria, even where the performance criteria is very, very much a practical criteria. They turn it into an underpinning question. Look, it can be fine, but to be fair, it's actually probably over assessment in a lot of circumstances in that particular case. If it's a performance evidence or a practical performance criteria, it should be dealt with as a practical assessment. Okay. You do not need to have a question for every PC, every PE, and every KE. Okay. Your knowledge questions should really focus on the knowledge evidence. That's how the unit is designed, right? You've got knowledge evidence, we've got performance evidence. The performance criteria are actually meant, okay, to break down in more detail the performance evidence, right? They're meant to break it down in steps. That's how the training packages were designed. Okay, they're not designed so that you have to ask a question against every single step. That was never the intent of how they were designed. So it's really important to like think more about quality than you do about quantity. Authenticity, obviously we're going to talk a little bit about AI as we're going through this. It is becoming more and more challenging as AI gets more sophisticated. The vast majority of students in my mind still don't know how to use it. I can pick AI in a fucking heartbeat. Excuse me. I can pick AI in a heartbeat. And those of us that work with AI on a regular basis, and if you're a trainer and assessor, I do recommend that you're working with AI on a regular basis, mainly because it makes your job heaps easier. That you should be able to pick that when your students are using it. There are things that are very, very clear that you can pick up very, very easily. American Z, okay? And by the way, I see this with RTOs as well, where like an email will come out, I see it in marketing all the time. Guys, Z's are they're an American Z. Okay, so I get it. Like I will occasionally slip and write something with a Z instead of with an S. However, for those of you that were raised in Australia and have always lived in Australia, okay, in Australia we don't use S's, we don't use Z's very much. We use S's. So that's a very clear indicator of AI. AI also likes to write using dot points. They're very, very big on their dot points. And in the latest derivation of ChatGPT, it loves alternating bold font with non-bold font. And it likes using little emojis in its dot points as well. It's a massive fan of emojis. So when I start to see a combination of those things, I will often go to AI. I think the other thing is that AI is often used to create bigger answers. So, this is also about the relationship that we have with students. Students by their nature, and I say this not for all students, but for the majority of students are quite lazy. And so they will give the answer in the shortest response that they can. So when you start to see highly verbose assessments, if that's not common for your students, particularly at a Cert 2, Cert 3 level, even at a Cert 4, that can be an indicator of AI as well. So all of those sorts of things are what we want to pick up. And then there's currency, and really currency only applies if you're starting looking at the RPL sort of perspective, and that's because the student evidence needs to demonstrate current skills, but for the vast majority of delivery that happens in the vet space, we're actually observing the students demonstrate the skill live at the time that we're deeming competency. So currency very rarely comes into it unless we're talking about it from that RPL perspective. So how do we go about doing validation? I talked about some of the things that we want to look for, but I guess there's a couple of different aspects that I want to talk to on validation. The first one is under the RTO standards, there's a lot more in talking about relation of risk. So certainly the way that we do this at Anawaya is when we're working with our clients, we do a risk rating on each of our products, on each of their training products. And so we want to take into account things like, is it a high-risk training product? Is it a TAE product? What is the volume of training and assessment that's being undertaken? So we have, a point system that we put together. If it's a high-risk training product, it gets so many points, depending on how many students, for like every 200 international students or 300 students overall. It gets a certain number of points that are enrolled into it. We also look at the completion percentage of that particular training product as well. So if I enroll 300 students into it and only 50 of them complete, that's a risk indicator that we take into account. We also look at if it's on the ASQA risk priorities. So is it international students? Is it under 18 students? Is it like a risky cohort? Is it a risky delivery method? Is it an online delivery method as opposed to like face-to-face in the classroom or in the workplace? So we take all of those factors into play. And from that, we come up with a risk rating for each of our products. And based on the risk rating of the product, that determines the validation schedule that it goes into, whether or not it's high, low, or medium. And that determines the frequency in which we undertake validation. The other thing that we'll do is we will use our Accelerate dashboards. And within my Accelerate dashboard every day, when I log into any RTO, one of the things that it tells me is it looks at the last 6 months of delivery, how many units we deemed competent, and it tells me the highest units that we did the most for, and I take that into account as well. And so the training product tells me how often I need to validate. And then I go into my Accelerate dashboard and I look at the training product and I pull which units were most often deemed competent for that particular training product. And that's where I take my validation from. When I'm doing validation, there's two types of validations that we do. So the best validation for your RTO to run is group validations that include your trainers and include a vet expert. Okay. That could be an internal person that is, for example, your compliance person, your curriculum development person, your quality manager, or it could be like an external expert like myself or some of our staff at NOI or the staff at Capacity or the girls at Hawkeye, anyone from any of those sorts of areas that you might be a person coming in like that. It's a group assessment. Okay. It's a group validation activity. And the reason why it's a group validation activity is because when you've got multiple people talking about things, you find that the learning that comes out of that, the consistency of interpretation that comes out of that is fantastic. We run heaps of these sessions, so we'll get 2 or 3 trainers together. We'll have somebody like myself, and we'll have like their RTO manager or their quality person, and there'll be the 5 of us sitting around. We'll smash out, 4 or 5. We'll smash out probably 10 assessments in a day. Okay, across maybe 2 units. You can definitely get more than that. Like I've had 5 of us each sitting with 2 assessments, everybody else sitting with 2 assessments, and I'll sit there with the assessor guide and the mapping guide, and I'll be reading out the answers, and everybody will be kind of cross-confirming. And if somebody goes, well, I don't know about this, we can talk about it as a group. We can also read the answer, and I'll be checking the mapping guide, and I'll go, do you think that answers that? And then we can have that group discussion as well. And I'll scribble across I'll scribble across the assessor guide. I'll scribble across the mapping guide. I'll do some remapping as part of that exercise. We'll tweak the language of the questions, or we'll tweak the language of the observations as we go through that process. It is a brilliant process. If your RTO has never run validation in that model before, I highly recommend that you consider it, because the productivity that comes out of it, the engagement that you get with your trainers, the understanding that you get from your trainers on what it actually means to collect evidence in line with the rules of evidence is very different than you would get in any other form of validation. So that's one form of validation. If you can schedule in those sessions a couple of times a year, like even just 2 or 3 times a year, so that you get that across the breadth of your staff, that's really brilliant. The other validation that we use is we have somebody like myself sitting with an industry person, or, if I've got if you've got somebody who's got both, and we run the assessment through AI. Obviously, depending on the AI subscription that you've got, have the ability to upload documents. Okay. And one of the things that we do as part of that process is that we get AI to do a validation. Not so much from the perspective of principles of assessment and rules of evidence, but what we get the AI to do is we get the AI to do a review and cross-compare each of the students' assessments. So I'll take 3 or 4 students from the same class, same assessment that did it at the same time. And what I will do is I will upload those assessments into AI and I will ask it to run an analysis on the type of language used, what's the difference in the language and the context of the responses, and does AI believe there's any collusion. I will do a review of it as well. AI will do a review of it, and hopefully we come to the same conclusion as to whether there is or is not AI or evidence of collusion as part of that process. It's probably a necessity in light of how AI is going and in how prolifically students are knowing how to use it. And this is the best way. And I've actually found that certainly with the latest, with older forms of ChatGPT and Bard and things like that, it was very, very poor. But when you can upload multiple documents and you can get it to do a cross comparison of how the students actually, like of the students' responses, it is getting pretty good at that. And obviously a lot of that will rely on getting your prompts correct. Because when it comes to any kind of AI, it's really going to boil down to how good and how detailed your prompts are. But that's certainly we've found that a really brilliant way of, just being able to use that combination of AI and human review in order to be able to come up with some really good evidence as to whether or not, your students are authentically participating in the assessment process. So 2 types of assessment there, 2 different purposes, but ultimately the assessment is boiling down to making a really good determination and judgment in terms of the principle of assessment and rules of evidence. So rules of evidence, specifically authenticity and sufficiency, is really what we're addressing in the AI version that I was talking about. That one can be done a lot more frequently because it doesn't involve as many people. The first version really broadly covers that principles of assessment, rules of evidence. It's not something that you need to be doing every month. But in an ideal world, you are doing it probably at least twice a year. That should be going into your governance calendar. We're going to be covering governance calendars in a separate podcast. But both of the, if you can have both of those methods happening in your college, and as I said, when you're determining who and what you're going to be working with, thinking about that risk rating perspective, that's a formula for a really robust, for a really robust validation system. The other thing that we do recommend doing, and this is certainly something that we utilize, is I have an AI note taker. Anytime we participate in validation, we have our AI note taker that records the whole thing, rather than doing like a physical hand tick point, tick point, tick point. My focus in a validation is actually on making any changes that need to be made to the mapping guide and to the assessor guide. And the AI is recording the whole session. And then from that, we can take the entire transcript. We can transcript that into notes and a validation report, and that then just automatically can get uploaded into your quality register by your student management system. Documenting validation is, again, an area where we see a lot of RTOs that really struggle. Having an AI note taker in the room and having the AI document that and then just turning that into your validation report. One, from an authenticity perspective, there's no question from the regulator as to when this was done and how this was done, because I can just show them the AI notes. But also it just makes that whole process so much quicker to follow through on. So that's kind of how we look at doing validation. We will do one more session next up on when validation shows problems, how we go about addressing that and how we go about determining the scope and what we want to do and how we want to handle that. So I hope you guys will stick around for that. I hope you guys have found this helpful. We will kind of try and put like a condensed thing of all of those helpful points into the blurb or into something like that for you. Otherwise, by all means, feel free to reach out. We do have that whole process is documented in our validation policies, and we've got a brand new policy set to align with the new 2025 standards. It includes all your policies and procedures, work health safety policies, employment, revised employment contracts and employment handbooks and things like that. So there's a whole range of stuff that's really, really helpful for RTOs. If you guys have any questions, by all means, pop them in the chat below and I will do my best to answer them. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. My name is Lauren Boone from NOI Education Services.